Hi there, I'm Shannon Decker, and I'm here to share the harm reduction workshop, which is based on fentanyl education from the No Overdose Nevada County campaign. The live trainings were also provided by Devin Bradley and Bethany Wilkins with Nevada County Public Health. Our agenda for this recorded training is harm reduction as a strategy for prevention, opioids as an overview for this class of drugs, and specifically fentanyl, which is a synthetic opioid. We're going to talk about Narcan as first aid, an antagonist for Narcan. We're going to talk about the Good Samaritan Law, and then we'll look at some local resources and support. So, why are we talking about this? Right now in the United States, we have a really big problem with opioid overdoses. It is becoming a leading cause of death for teens, young adults, and people across the lifespan. We can all become aware of what's going on and we can be empowered to take action. We can think of this the same way we think about first aid. We think about first aid because we're concerned about family members and loved ones. We might have a family member who's prescribed an opioid pain medication. We might have friends who are actively using substances. They might be experimenting or socially using different substances. You yourself might be prescribed pain medication or choose to use drugs. And so we need to be aware of what's going on. As a first aider, we can learn how to save someone from an overdose. And we can keep Narcan on hand and easy to access at all times. This is part of being a first aider. So, harm reduction is the strategy that we're going to take in this response to the opioid crisis. In the past, there have been a lot of strategies for substance use where there was fear and intimidation. There was a lot of just say no or zero tolerance policies around substances. But the reality is that people use drugs. People have used drugs, since the beginning of time, and the more we understand, the better decisions we can make. So, our harm reduction strategy encourages people to make the safest and healthiest choices that they can based on their circumstances. We are going to approach this from a judgment free zone. We're going to respect people's decisions and we're going to use realism and empathy. So, by telling somebody not to do something, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily not going to do it. They might still do it, but they might not ask questions. They might not think about doing it in the safest way possible. And then it creates shame and stigma. So, let's learn as much as we can so we can make the best decisions possible. We already use harm reduction in other areas of life. Many people use seatbelts to protect themselves from car accident injuries and death. Many people use sunscreen to prevent sunburn, sun damage to the skin, as well as melanoma cancer. Many people use condoms to prevent against STIs and unwanted pregnancies. People use hand sanitizer, people use gun locks, and when it comes to the opioid epidemic, people use Narcan and fentanyl testing strips. So we think about substance use and drug use on a continuum. So on this continuum, we have people who don't use at all, they abstain from substance use. And next, we have people who are experimenting, that experimental use, where it's like, I don't know, I just want to try this. We have people who recreationally use, they use in social situations. There's people with regular use. There's people who misuse or abuse. And then we have people who become dependent on a substance, addiction. And so, no matter where anyone falls on this, everything's valid. Some are healthier decisions than others. We always have the choice to not use substances. But if people are choosing to use drugs, let's find the safest way possible. We can be aware of where we are, what's our environment, what's our location. We can think about what is our mindset, what is our mental health, and who's there to support us if we're going to engage in substance use. And then, just based right now on where we're at in this opioid crisis, we need to encourage people to know about and to use fentanyl testing strips as well as to carry Narcan. So, if we're engaging in experimental use or social use, recreation, or even more moderate use, you're probably engaging in partying. Or as you grow up, you might be exposed to more partying types of behaviors. And so having some harm reduction strategies in your pocket can be really helpful. We always encourage people to use a buddy system. And we use a buddy system in other parts of our life besides just parties. As we move out of our house and away from our families, we need to tell people where we're going. We need to be able to check in and have some accountability. So, if we are talking about a party, we want to bring a friend to the party whenever we're going. We want to make sure that we're not just going to things by ourselves. We want to keep track of our friends. We want to make sure that our friends are keeping track of us. It's not a one-way street. And we don't leave the party without our friends. We need to check on them if they've been gone for a long time. The same way they should be checking on us if we've kind of disappeared from the scene for a little while. A buddy system is really important. It's important if you go running. It's important if you go skiing. It's important if you're going to house parties. It's important if you're going shopping. Like, this is something that we use as humans. Typically, you've already had that in your family system, but as you increase your independence, making sure that you continue to use a buddy system is really important. Having a plan. So when you're especially going into a remote area, you need to tell people where you're going. Tell trusted adults where you're going and when you should be home. And make sure that you have a charged cell phone that's ready to call for help if you need a ride or if you need assistance. And just as general caution, 911 can typically be called even if you don't have cell phone service. Your cell phone needs to be charged, but if you're out of service, you should still be able to get through to 911. And then the piece that's new, it's new within the last 3 to 5 years, is having Narcan. Know how to use Narcan, which is that anti opioid overdose drug. You bring it with you. You don't just like leave it in your car or, leave it in your dorm room. And you need to have a designated person in a party setting who has the Narcan, who knows how to use it. Having Narcan on hand in the environment is vital at partying environments at this point. If you go to music festivals, there's something called the Yellow Balloon Project. So you can scan the crowd and you can look to see who is walking around with a big yellow balloon. This is a person that is typically sober. They are trained in first aid and they're carrying Narcan. So if you get into danger, if you need assistance from a trusted person who's there, they're non judgmental, they really support people in a harm reduction capacity, look for the yellow balloon. So, what is an opioid? Well, an opioid is a class of drugs. So, there are illegal drugs like heroin, there are synthetic drugs like fentanyl, and then there's legal prescription drugs like oxycodone. So, fentanyl is a synthetic type of opioid, and fentanyl is used in the healthcare setting in a very appropriate way. But then there's black market synthetic fentanyl that has been used to contaminate our drug supply, and they are using it to make counterfeit drugs as well. So all of these opioids, what they do is they make people slower or sleepy at a low dose. If we get a higher dose, it can result in our breathing really slowing down, which in turn makes our heart rate slow down to the point where it can stop. So, what's happening is our opioid receptors on our nerves are decreasing our ability to feel pain while increasing our feelings of pleasure. This is called euphoria. If you've seen the show Euphoria, there's some heroin use in that, um, and or some opioid use. But that is what this term euphoria is coming from. So, we need to take a look at some of the data, and I am approaching this slide to say that these are our fellow humans who have passed as a result of opioids, and this is really, really tragic. It's also very preventable, and I just want to take a moment to say that most of us have been touched in some way by this opioid epidemic that's been going on for um, since about 1996 is when this really started to take hold in our country. And so my heart goes out to those who have been touched. If you haven't, please take some time to practice empathy because this is something that really is growing at a dangerous rate. At this point, the opioid overdose deaths have become a leading cause of death in the US for adults 18 to age 45. So if you're close to age 18, this really does impact you. These deaths land in this accidental category which kind of fluctuates in those top 10 rates in the US. Again, this is a US problem. We're not seeing this everywhere else across the United States. I'm sorry, across the world. This is a US problem. And when we look at these trend lines, you can see that dark blue line is a synthetic opioid. And in about 2016 is when we really started to see synthetic opioids making a huge impact in death and overdose. Um, I graduated high school in 2001, and at that time, we were already in an epidemic, and there was a lot of awareness around not misusing opioids. But you can see as we progress through those mid 2000s, the death rate continued to increase. It was when the United States government started stepping in to control the amount of prescriptions that were being prescribed and the amount of pills that people were able to take, opioid pills, pain pills. And when we started to decrease that, people who were addicted started to look towards black markets to obtain those pain pills that they were addicted to. It makes sense. And so the market shifted because we couldn't get the pharmaceuticals. Instead, we were getting counterfeit pills made with synthetic fentanyl. And a lot of the rest of our drug supply started to become contaminated with fentanyl. And we'll talk more about that. Now, when we're looking at California data, we're seeing that that trend line is very comparable to our United States numbers. We see a big spike in 2020. And what happened in 2020? COVID. We were locked down and people became really anxious. They became, really isolated and shut down. There was a lot of despair that took place. And as far as the drug markets, we started to get a lot of counterfeit pills into the hands of young adults and teens who might have been thinking, hey, I'm going to take this Percocet to help with my anxiety, even though I wasn't prescribed it, even though I didn't get it from a US pharmacy. I'm going to take this drug to help with my anxiety. But in fact, that was a counterfeit pill. It was laced with fentanyl, and a person, many people in California, this became a common situation. The rates in Nevada County, Placer County are very comparable here. We didn't start seeing fentanyl related deaths in Nevada County until 2020. So, as far as opioids go, there are generic names. Generic names like hydrocodone, oxycodone, morphine, codeine, fentanyl. These are all the generic names. And then there's brand names. So you might hear Vicodin or Oxycontin or MS Contin or Tylenol with codeine. So all of these drugs are the brand names. Heroin is a drug that doesn't have any healthcare purpose. It's simply an illicit street drug. And when we're looking at opioids, we compare everything against morphine. Morphine was the original opioid drug that we used in healthcare. It comes from a poppy plant. The first time that we had an epidemic of opioid deaths in the United States, it was after the Civil War. Morphine was used to treat the pain of our Civil War soldiers who became addicted. And so this is what we compare everything against. For a person who has no tolerance for opioids, a lethal dose would be like a pea sized amount of morphine. When it comes to heroin, which again is not FDA approved, it has no healthcare purpose, it's twice as strong as morphine. And so, like a sunflower seed without the shell, that amount would be a lethal dose for an individual without a tolerance for heroin. Now, fentanyl, this is the one that we're focusing on today. Fentanyl is 100 times as strong as morphine. And so, just a sesame seed amount could put a person into a lethal overdose if they don't have a tolerance that's built up. Now, that sesame seed isn't something that you're necessarily going to be able to see to identify. You're not going to be able to taste it or smell it. And typically, it's not just the seed itself. It'll be crushed up into a powder, it'll be liquefied. It's something that you just aren't going to have in front of you knowing that you're taking that. Some of the other opioids on here, suafentanil is a veterinary medication, and then carafentanil is made in laboratories and it's used in like weapons of of mass destruction. So, hopefully, this puts it into perspective as to what we're dealing with and how strong this is. We're going to watch a quick video about a character by the name of Susan to see how Susan becomes addicted to opioids, what happens in her body, and how she is kind of predisposed or at risk for addiction.
This is Susan. Susan loves to bike. While out for a ride, she falls and breaks her arm. Special cells called neurons send a signal through the spinal cord to the brain, which interprets the signal as pain. Susan understands the pain means she needs to go to the hospital, and her body is equipped for survival, helping her not to panic so she can seek help. Many of her neurons are covered in proteins called opioid receptors. These receptors act like a brake to slow down the neuron's ability to send pain signals. When injured, her body releases natural painkillers called endorphins. Like a key in a lock, endorphins activate opioid receptors, slowing down the pain signal and preventing a panic. Susan gets treated for the broken bone, but 3 months later, her arm still hurts. And now that pain is making her feel depressed and anxious. So her doctor prescribes an opioid painkiller. There are many different opioids, but they all share a chemical similarity to our own endorphins. This allows them to bind to the same opioid receptors and stop pain signals. But that's not all they do. Deep inside Susan's brain is a region called the ventral tegmental area, or VTA for short. The VTA is full of neurons that produce a chemical called dopamine. When something good happens, dopamine is released, giving Susan a feeling of pleasure. This helps teach her brain to keep seeking out good things. To keep dopamine neurons in check, inhibitory neurons keep the brakes on until something good comes along. Just like the pain neuron, these neurons are covered in opioid receptors. When Susan takes the painkiller prescribed by her doctor, the opioid receptors turn off the inhibitory neurons and release the brake on the dopamine neurons. The rush of dopamine temporarily eliminates Susan's depression and anxiety, and she feels relief, calmness, and even euphoria. As Susan continues to take the painkillers, her brain responds by trying to regain its balance. Her inhibitory neurons work extra hard, even when the opioid receptors are activated, and it becomes harder and harder for her dopamine neurons to release dopamine. Susan finds that she needs to increase her dose of painkillers in order to feel comfortable. This is called tolerance. Eventually, Susan's pills run out. Inhibitory neurons that had been working overtime are let loose, clamping down on those dopamine neurons and shutting them off almost completely. Now, not only is Susan in pain, but the depression and anxiety come back. On top of that, Susan feels ravaged by an inescapable physical sickness far worse than any flu. Susan's body is going through withdrawal. Most people who take opioids for a long time tend to experience some withdrawal, but they can still stop taking the pills and return to normal. But for people like Susan, it's not so easy. Her genetics and the environment she grew up in put her at a higher risk for addiction. Her withdrawal symptoms aren't just unpleasant, they're unbearable. Susan thinks the only way to feel normal is to find more opioids. And this is how the cycle of opioid addiction emerges, driven by a brain trying to regain its balance. But there is hope for Susan. Though the road to recovery can be challenging and there may be setbacks, treatment can retrain Susan's brain. With the help of medication and therapy, Susan finds pleasure in her life once again.
Okay, so that video really highlighted stigma. Susan experienced quite a lot of stigma, and for individuals with substance use disorders, that social process that reinforces relationships of power and control, that's what creates like the us versus them. Like they can't control their use, but I can. Somehow I'm better than them. But this is what keeps people out and away and down and doesn't allow them to seek help as quickly as they could if we reduce stigma by offering compassionate support. Really trying to look at people for who they are and not the drugs that they use, working to treat people with dignity and respect, because that means that they're going to be more likely to reach out for help in the future. So we need to avoid hurtful labels. Instead of referring to someone as an addict, we can talk about someone who is addicted to a substance. It's not my brother is an addict, it's my brother has an addiction. Um, and that's not necessarily the only quality about him. Um, Susan also, it was interesting to see how Susan was injured and became addicted, that she was predisposed to addiction because of her genetic makeup, as well as a lot of the adverse experiences that she had in her childhood. And that's really something to take a deeper understanding of when you have the time, because there is so much addiction, that not just to opioids, but addiction in life, and it really does impact a lot of people in the United States. So stigma is one piece that we need to look at, but then let's look at, the logistics of what is this drug and what's happening. So fentanyl is that synthetic. It's about 100 times stronger than morphine. If you look at these pills here, we've got two sets of oxycodone. The one on the left is an authentic oxycodone that was purchased at a U.S. pharmacy. It is real. The second one on the right is fake. It is made from a pill press. It looks exactly the same. It has filler and it has fentanyl. The filler can be anything, whatever cheap materials a drug manufacturer, a black market drug manufacturer can get. Unlike a pharmaceutical grade oxycodone, which has to be made in a laboratory and it has to be measured out and distributed equally so that there are no like chunks of the drug that settles in one place. A fake oxycodone or a fentanyl can be made however. Um, our distributors of black market drugs like cocaine, heroin, MDMA, ketamine, amphetamines, what they're doing is they're cutting these drugs with fentanyl, because that means that they can have even less of like the cocaine product. They can cut it really poorly and then lace it with fentanyl so that a person still gets a response. They can still get that euphoria. It's not the same high as a cocaine high, but it's, a response. And so that drug distributor, that drug dealer is still able to make a profit and create a client. Now, the problem is that fentanyl is so much more potent than other drugs. And that if people don't know that they're in those drugs, that's a major problem. That's a poisoning. So we are seeing pills like Adderall, Xanax, Percocet, some of those pills here in the Truckee Tahoe area that are fake pills, they look exactly like an actual Xanax, but it's made with fentanyl. So our US pharmacies are not selling counterfeit pills. Our dispensaries that only sell marijuana, they are not selling fentanyl laced marijuana. This is all coming from the black market, from plugs who are distributing these perks to our citizens. So the other images here, we have heroin. So that vial of heroin, that would be enough for a person to potentially have a fatal overdose if they don't have a tolerance to that much. And then with fentanyl, you can see that it's the same potency as the heroin, but it's just a couple of grains. That's how much could be deadly for a person who doesn't have tolerance. The other image is of rainbow fentanyl. So those all are oxycodone looking pills, but they're laced with fentanyl. So when we think of these like fentanyls, we want to remember that the fentanyl is not evenly distributed. So a good analogy is a chocolate chip cookie. So a chocolate chip cookie, we don't grind up the chocolate and evenly distribute it throughout the entire cookie. We have chunks of it. That's what's going to happen in a fentanyl. In a powder, like if we were talking about cocaine, the fentanyl might be more dense and it'll settle to the bottom of the powder. But on a pill, there could be like one side of the pill that has a big rock of fentanyl and the other side that doesn't. And sometimes we have people who, if they're like experimenting with use, they might split a pill. Let's say we've got two teenagers who are really anxious and they just want to calm down, or they get a hold of an Adderall, but the Adderall wasn't prescribed to them. They didn't get it from a US based pharmacy. They split it and they each take half. One part of that pill might have fentanyl in it when the other side doesn't. But the good news here is that we can test for fentanyl. We can test any substance that can be liquefied, and we can liquefy pretty much anything.
Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid. Things like morphine and heroin are opiates that are made from the poppy plant, versus fentanyl is a synthetic made in a lab opioid that hits the opioid receptor. It's really potent, it's really strong. We use it in the hospital all the time. It's a really safe drug when used properly by doctors and nurses, but when it's really concentrated and people are using it at home, they can accidentally overdose very easily. It's a common myth that just by touching fentanyl, you can absorb it, but you really can't. And it's important that we emphasize and clarify that. It's so poorly absorbed through the skin that pharmaceutical companies actually spent millions and millions of dollars to develop something called a fentanyl patch. It's a very special way to deliver fentanyl in a patch that you wear. And even then, it's not very well absorbed. But definitely the powder or pills or anything that you find, not really absorbed through the skin. People who have an opioid toxicity, opioid overdose that ingested some fentanyl or injected fentanyl, they have minutes, maybe just moments to live. So pausing, putting on whole body suit, PPE, or waiting for other people to arrive means that person might die. So we really need to intervene and help them as quickly as possible. That might be by doing CPR. It might mean by giving the antidote, which I carry with myself all the time, Narcan, naloxone. So we have just moments to do that. And so waiting because we're concerned about skin exposure is not correct. Inhaling fentanyl can technically cause an overdose, but it doesn't get aerosolized very well. So fentanyl has something called a low vapor pressure. So you really can't aerosolize it without some very complex mechanism. You can play with it, you can technically throw it up in the air and have it fall, and you really won't breathe significant amounts in. So it's not really dangerous to walk in a building that has fentanyl in it. You don't need a fancy respirator or anything like that. So I told a friend of mine recently who's a paramedic about this because she was really worried about getting exposed to fentanyl. And the relief on her face when I clarified that it's not really something she needs to worry about, that she's not going to walk into a building and touch fentanyl or breathe it in and have something bad happen to her, it was such a relief. She told her family and they were relieved. So I think it's really important that we make sure everyone understands how this works. When someone overdoses on fentanyl or another opioid, their breathing will slow. They'll eventually become unconscious and their breathing may stop altogether. And that's how it's deadly. If you find someone who's overdosed on fentanyl or another opioid, you should call 911. And if you have Narcan, naloxone, you should administer to them. The two most common ways it's administered are intranasally through the nose, and then also an injection. And in California, you can get Narcan, naloxone. Anyone can get it without a prescription. Walking into a space, evaluating a person who's overdosed on fentanyl, calling 911, even doing CPR and definitely administering Narcan are all 100% safe to do.
Okay, so hopefully that video shared just a little bit about demystifying some of these myths that we have around fentanyl. Several years ago, I was responding to a school that lost two students to synthetic opioids. They were 14 years old, and their peers were really concerned while they were waiting for toxicology reports to come back from the coroner's office, which takes months. It's not like a week long test. These tests can take months. There was a lot of fear. Like, if these friends of ours overdosed on this synthetic drug that's kind of microscopic, like, what happens if I touch a doorknob that has that drug on it, or residue on a on a locker? Um, and so fentanyl does not enter your system through touch. It doesn't come through your skin. It has to come through a mucous membrane in order to be absorbed into the body. Law enforcement agents need to take more considerations than first responders, especially if they're dealing with like an opioid bust of some kind. Whereas for us, we're typically only going to be exposed to individuals who have consumed a counterfeit or a contaminated drug and they don't have it on the outside of their body. So, some of the risk factors for an opioid overdose would be using multiple drugs. Let's say that I started out and I decided that I wanted to socially use substances. And so I'm drinking at a party, and then somebody offers me an Adderall, and I decide to take that. So I'm using multiple substances. My my non-sober brain is maybe not making the best decisions, and I decide to take a pill that's not prescribed to me, and I don't know where it came from. I didn't pick it up at a US pharmacy. That is additional risks for potentially overdosing. The purity and the potency of a substance, as well as my tolerance for that substance. Do I have any exposure to opioids? How often have I been taking opioids? That would change how my body's going to react. Other drug related risk factors would be like having new supply or new product coming in. So, living where we live, we've got the 80. We've got people who are distributing drugs from Sacramento and the Bay Area across to Reno and then into middle America. So, we kind of live on a pipeline. So, we've got product coming through. Um, we also live in a tourist economy. So we have tourists that are coming here for a weekend, for a week, for a month, for the summer, for the winter. And when they come, they're bringing with them supply and product from outside of our area. We also have transient people. We have people who move here for the ski season to work in the ski industry or the summer, recreation industry, and they're bringing product with them, and so that yeah, that changes things. And then how a person is using a substance, their method, when that changes, that puts us at risk. Some other situation related risks would be like if a person is using alone. If somebody uses alone, no one else knows what they've taken, no one else is watching them to say, hey, I think Shannon's asleep, but I haven't noticed her breathing. I should probably check on her. If no one knows what I'm doing and I'm by myself, no one's going to recognize when I start to overdose. A person's physical health or mental health can impact their risk for overdose. The physical environment, it's going to be very different how my body responds if I'm outside in the woods, if I'm out in a ski resort and it's winter versus it's really, really hot during the summer. The physical environment of where I'm at can impact a person who's recently been released from incarceration or they're coming out of a substance use treatment center, as well as the stigma that just surrounds substance use. This can be a risk factor for a person of, overdosing on an opioid. And so I want to give an example. When I was in college, remember that I graduated high school in 2001. During that time, we had the big war on drugs. We had ad campaigns like Just Say No and Dare to Keep Kids Off Drugs. We all signed pledges that we would never use drugs. There was an ad that ran on cartoons that was a man standing in his kitchen. He was frying an egg, and the pan is hot and ready, and it's like, "This is your brain." And then he cracks an egg, and he says, "This is your brain on drugs." And then he goes, "Any questions?" And for kids, for youth, we're like, yeah, we've got a lot of questions. Like, is that my brain on methamphetamine, or is that my brain on marijuana, or is that my brain on nicotine or caffeine, or what are you even talking about? But it didn't create an opportunity for us to have that conversation. So, um, we are having that conversation. The adults in your life are having that conversation with you. We're not shutting it down and saying, don't ever use drugs. We're saying it's a really healthy choice to not use drugs. But if you are going to experiment, if you're going to use in a recreational way, let's be really smart about this. Let's talk about it because there's a lot of risk. So let's take a look at the signs of an overdose. How do you know that somebody's overdosing on an opioid? They are not going to be responsive to stimulus. If I am shouting their name, Steven, wake up, Steven. And he's not waking up. If I'm shaking him and I'm talking to him and he's not responding, then what I want to do is I want to make a fist with my knuckles. I'm going to drag it on his sternum, and when I push really hard, that should create some type of response. That is really painful. If he's not responding, it's a potential overdose. Now, when a person takes an opioid, their pupils become pinpoints. It's like the lead of a pencil. And so if you open someone's eyes and their pupils are pinpoint, they could potentially be overdosing from an opioid. If somebody's fingernails and their lips are starting to turn blue or gray, that's because the blood isn't pumping to these extremities, and that's a potential sign. And the key thing here is that irregular, shallow breath, or they're not breathing at all. They might be making a gurgling sound. They call this a death rattle, and it's because your body is desperately trying to get oxygen, but our opioid receptors are so shut down. They're in such a state of euphoria that they're not working anymore. Now, we don't have to play detective. You're not a medical professional. You don't need to be. Time is critical. We have to get air into their body. They need to be breathing oxygen. So we want to give them Narcan right away. Narcan does not hurt someone if they are not overdosing on an opioid. Narcan doesn't hurt kids. It doesn't hurt the elderly. It doesn't hurt pregnant women. It doesn't hurt animals. You can be any age and carry it. In the state of California, you have to be 12 or older to have Narcan without a parent permission. You don't need a prescription, but it's not yet over the counter. In the future, you'll be able to go to a pharmacy and just buy it over the counter like you would Tylenol, but it's not there yet. So let's take a look at Narcan. This is that opioid antagonist nasal spray. Naloxone is the drug, and then Narcan is the brand that's most available in Truckee, Tahoe. It comes as a nasal spray. It looks like this. Okay. Comes in a box. And in this box are two of these nasal spray kits. It attaches to Narcan or naloxone, attaches to the opioid receptors in the brain, and it blocks the effects of the opioids. So our diagram there, those blue pieces, those are our opioid receptors. The opioid settles, just like we saw in Susan's video. And then the Narcan comes, it wipes it off so that we can start to feel again. You're not going to get in trouble for giving Narcan to someone, even if they're not overdosing on an opioid. You just come and they're unresponsive. Let's say somebody had a heart attack and I don't know, they're not responsive and I don't know what it is. I'm going to use my first aid skills and I can apply Narcan. I've called 911. We're going to get them connected to care. The Narcan isn't going to do anything to damage them. So, let's say we come across someone, we're at Safeway, and we see someone in the parking lot and they're laying by a car. And it's like, oh my goodness, what's happened here? Maybe they had a heart attack. Maybe they had a stroke or a seizure, or they fell on ice and they hit their head, or they're overdosing, on opioids. You don't have to be the detective. All we can do is what we're trained for. And if you are prepared to respond, like maybe you've had CPR training or wilderness training, or you're just a caring citizen, you can respond under the Good Samaritan Law. You're protected. So if you're with someone else, you're like, "Hey, Sally, call 911," and you go over and you're like, "Are you okay?" If you're by yourself, you want to go ahead and administer the Narcan that you carry in your first aid kit, and then you call 911. Or you send someone into the grocery store and say, "Hey, go get some Narcan. They've got it at the front desk." And then you bring it out and give it to them while you're calling 911. Remember, you can put 911 on speakerphone so that you can be taking action while the 911 operator is getting information from you and giving you directions. You got somebody laying there and you're like, "Hey, sir, I'm going to give you Narcan." The same way you would be like, "Sir, I'm going to give you CPR." So the way that this works is you're going to open the box, you're going to take the Narcan out. This one has expired, so I'm going to use it as a model. You open up the Narcan. It has instructions, but we're in an emergency, so we don't have time to read these. That's why we're prepared with this training ahead of time. We pull the Narcan out. We've got the person, hopefully they're laying on their back. We can tilt their head up And then we administer the Narcan by putting our thumb on the plunger and our fingers are resting here. This is the part that's going to go into one nostril. You can push your finger against the other side. And what you're going to do is you don't have to prime it. You're just going to push it all the way in. The plunger goes all the way in to deploy the 4 milligram dose, the entire dose. You don't want to waste it outside of their nose. Now, once it goes in, it goes into their sinuses and gets absorbed into their bloodstream. It should hit the brain and the opioid receptors, block those receptors so that, or wipe those receptors so that we can resume our bodily functions of breathing and our heart beating. So, what I'm going to do right now is I'm not on opioids. I'm not going to administer this to myself, but I just want you to know I'm not on opioids. So, if this were to get into my system, nothing would happen because I don't have opioid receptors that are full of opioids. Um, this is not going to cause any harm, and that it looks, let's see, just like this. And so that goes into the bloodstream. So, hopefully, that person has a really low dose in them and they just start breathing. Sometimes, especially with fentanyl, it's a lot of opioids. So they might not start breathing right away. What we can do is we can start giving them rescue breaths. We need them on their back. We tilt their chin up. We can plug their nose and breathe into their mouth. We are breathing for them. One breath every 5 seconds. I hope you've got 911 on speakerphone so they can be talking you through this as well. But we breathe for them for about 2 to 3 minutes. And if they're not responsive, um, and they're not breathing on their own yet, then what 911 will probably have you do is to give that second dose, because there's 2 doses in this box, into the other nostril. If it hasn't already happened, make sure you call 911 as soon as you can. And if that person does start to respond, they start to breathe on their own or they become alert, then what we want to do is we want to put them in the recovery position. This will help prevent choking. So we just tuck one hand under their chin and we bring one leg out like a kickstand so that they're on their side. Now, when they come to from an opioid overdose, you think of this as being like in the most pleasant sleep that you've ever had in your entire life, and you're being woken up by like being hit by a semi truck. So they're going to be in a lot of pain. They're withdrawing from an opioid. They're withdrawing from euphoria. So they're going to be confused. They're going to be scared or angry. They could be shaking. They could be, nauseous. They can be sick. And so another thing that could be alarming for them is to have police or paramedic response. And so you can be reassuring. You're a civilian, you're a peer, maybe you're a friend or a relative. You can say, I'm here with you, you're safe, or help is on the way. Use some reassurance. Now, if they come to and they're really aggravated, step back. Keep yourself safe. You don't necessarily need to be in their face. It can be a really alarming thing. Um, the next thing we're going to talk about are fentanyl testing strips. So, like I said, the only way to know if something has fentanyl in it is to test it. And you can test any substance that's been converted to liquid. We provide the fentanyl testing strips in our community. They look like this. It's going to come with some instructions. Inside is a Good Samaritan card. It's going to have 3 testing strips, and then it's going to have a microscope so that you can follow these instructions. They're very thorough. It's going to tell you exactly what you need to do. It's a lot of reading material, but if this is something that you are, engaging in, the only way to know if a drug has fentanyl in it is to test it. If you have to liquefy part of the substance, you can still consume it if it tests that it does not have fentanyl in it. So 1 line means stop. This is positive for fentanyl. 2 means, all right, there's no fentanyl in this portion. Remember that chocolate chip cookie effect. Did I get the right amount? Did I get the right sample? And these instructions will really help you know what I'm talking about. If you decide that, yep, it tested, it's got 2 lines, it's like, all right, do I still want to do this? No drug is 100% safe. Is someone else here? And do I have naloxone? Then we can proceed. There are some people who don't have a lot of choices. Maybe they are past recreational use and they are misusing a substance. So, for other cases, we've got the Never Use Alone hotline where they can call and have a designated support person. I'm gonna share an example. When I was in college, there was a point when I decided that I was gonna self-diagnose myself with ADHD. And so people take Adderall, brain fart, sorry. People take Adderall to work through ADHD. And so it was finals time, and I said, you know what? I'm going to take Adderall. And I reached out to a friend and said, hey, I know that you have a prescription for Adderall. Can I please get one from you? And she was like, sure. Did I know that this was wrong? Yeah. Did I care? Not really. I felt like this was a risk I was willing to take. So I went to her dorm and then she gave me an Adderall pill. And I was like, thank you. I'm going to study with this. And she said, oh, by the way, that's not mine. I got it from my RA. And it was like, well, I mean, all of this is really bad decision making, but it happens. This is the experimental use piece where we know the risks and we decide to do it anyway. A better choice would have been to not do this, but I did it. And I did not have ADHD. So did it work? No, I could not study. When you take Adderall that's not prescribed to you and it's not part of, a medical need, it works in the opposite way. So it was like I had just taken speed. So I couldn't study. And once I eventually fell asleep, the next day I had a raging migraine headache and I just completely failed my final. And that sucked. But that was the worst of it. Like, that was it. I never thought to myself, "Hey, maybe this RA didn't get this pill from a pharmacy. Maybe this RA, purchased a counterfeit pill and there's really fentanyl in there." Because up until 3 to 5 years ago, that was not the case. So your generation has this new problem of fentanyl being mixed into our drug supply, and this is very problematic. It means that we need to take extreme caution. If you're going to be using recreationally, if you're going to be experimenting, we have to be testing for fentanyl. We need to have Narcan on hand. We need to know where it is. We need to know where to get it. Colleges are now requiring people in their move in list of what to bring to campus, they are requiring people to bring Narcan with them. Um, so, what about getting in trouble? So, we have Good Samaritan laws. In your um, testing strip packet, there is a business card for the Good Samaritan Law. This is a law that protects us. So if you're giving first aid and let's say the person does not live, you're protected under Good Samaritan Law. Let's say that you are engaging in substance use, like you're at a party drinking and you recognize that someone is asleep, but then you get closer and you're seeing all the signs of an opioid overdose. So you respond and you call 911. You will not get in trouble for drinking underage. As long as there's only personal amounts of drugs or drug paraphernalia, you won't be arrested or charged. As long as you're not distributing and selling illegal products. There are, there are some caveats, like if someone were on probation, they were breaking probation, if other illegal things are happening, like illegal guns or drug production, if children are being endangered, anything like that, if you're obstructing the scene, if you're interfering, or if somebody's overdosing and you don't respond, then you could be prosecuted. But this law is available in every state in the US that I'm aware of. They're newer laws, they haven't always been on the books, but they were created to make people feel safer calling 911. So if you move out of state, that was something that you should probably check into. Not every state has Narcan available at no cost. So there's a lot that's going on here where if you're going to school or you're moving out of state, it would be really wise to check out your state laws. Now, locally, if you need to make a report, let's say that your younger brother is on Snapchat and he gets a plug who reaches out and wants to sell him a perk. What we want to do is we want to report that so that we can end that, so that your little brother or you or whoever approaches you doesn't end up harming anyone. So, some of the resources that we have, if you need to report something, would be like school officer David McKay. You can reach out to him. We have non-emergency lines for Truckee, if you live in Truckee town limits, or if you're out in the counties, if you're in Placer or Nevada County, those are the non-emergency lines. And again, if it is an emergency, if it's a suspected overdose, if you are concerned about something in an emergency capacity, go ahead and call 911. Um, we have a lot of resources. We've got handouts that can walk you through, using Narcan, using fentanyl testing strips, looking at what are the basic signs and how do you use Narcan in some really small pieces of literature. Um, but these are our community partners. So you can obtain Narcan and fentanyl testing strips at any of these locations. You can get help with someone who's struggling with substances at Nevada County Public Health, Gateway Mountain Center, as well as Tahoe Forest. With Tahoe Forest, if you go to the emergency department and you walk up to the front window, you can request Narcan, you can request fentanyl testing strips 24 hours. They're not going to ask you your name or any data. They're just going to say, okay, here you go. And they're probably going to want to try to give you some literature, and depending on who's on staff, they might be able to give you a short training on how to use it. You can reach out to me at the Speedy Foundation, and I can either put a package together of the Narcan or the fentanyl testing strips for you to pick up. You can walk over to Gateway Mountain Center and pick up materials, harm reduction materials and supplies there. So scan that code and check out which resources you're interested in and where to check them out. If you have questions, you're welcome to reach out to me or Bethany or Devin. You can learn more about this campaign at nooverdosennc.nevadacounty.com. And as we wrap up, you're welcome to give us some information. That QR code on the left is for training evaluation, and on the right is to request harm reduction supplies from me. And I want you to just kind of do a quick reflection. What's one sign of an overdose? We've got blue lips, blue fingertips, we've got pinpoint pupils, no response, verbal or physical touch. How about not breathing? Okay, gasping for air. Those are signs of overdose. Okay, if you have to choose, do you call 911 before or after administering Narcan? The important thing is getting oxygen in, so give the Narcan and then call 911. And then how long do you need to wait before you give that second dose in the alternate nostril? You're going to wait 2 to 3 minutes. Hopefully, you're getting rescue breaths and you've got an operator on 911 who's talking you through this. But you don't have to give both doses at once. You give one dose and give it some time to get into the system before giving that second dose. So, again, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Thank you so much.